This wasn't a speech. It was a rupture. On a Miami airport tarmac late at night after a college football championship, Donald Trump stepped in front of cameras and spoke in a way presidents usually don't. Not from a podium, not from the Oval Office, but loose, unscripted, and openly confrontational. And within minutes, he crossed lines that most leaders never touch in public. Here's the paradox. He talked about peace while threatening allies. He claimed global stability while floating territorial acquisition. And he did it casually, as if none of it required permission, process, or restraint. If that sounds abstract, it's not, because when power is spoken about this way, the consequences don't stay on the tarmac. They move into your economy, your alliances, and eventually your life. Factually, Trump confirmed on camera that he invited Vladimir Putin to join what he called a board of peace. When asked directly if Putin was invited, his answer was one word: yeah. Moments later, he turned on France, threatening a 200% tariff on French wine and champagne after President Emmanuel Macron declined to participate. Same event, same microphones, same breath. And then came Greenland. Trump said, "We have to have it," dismissing Denmark's sovereignty and arguing the United States should take control because, in his words, a boat went there 500 years ago. This is where the story stops being about rhetoric and starts becoming about risk. Because once a president speaks this way in public, the next question isn't what he meant. It's who's supposed to stop him. What happened next matters more than the spectacle itself. Because this wasn't an isolated outburst. It fit a pattern that's been forming in plain sight. In the same appearance, Trump didn't just talk about peace and trade. He reframed power as something personal. Allies were treated like obstacles. Institutions were treated like suggestions. And international rules were spoken about as if they only apply when they're convenient. Factually, this all unfolded in one continuous exchange. Questions about Putin led directly into threats against France. That flowed into claims about Greenland. Then came assertions about NATO, where Trump said on camera that he had done more for NATO than anybody else, and that without him, NATO might not even exist. Notice what's missing here. There was no mention of Congress, no reference to treaties, no acknowledgement of allied consent, just unilateral ownership of outcomes. Now watch how the framing shifts. Trump didn't describe these ideas as proposals. He described them as inevitabilities. We have to have it. They'll join. I'll put a tariff on them. Language like that matters because it signals something deeper than policy preference. It signals how decisions are being made. And here's the cognitive trigger most people miss. If this is how global power is discussed publicly, off the cuff, what does that say about the guardrails behind the scenes? Are there limits being tested or limits being ignored? This is where the story expands beyond one night in Miami, because reactions didn't come only from commentators. They came from lawmakers, from journalists, and from within Trump's own political orbit, openly questioning whether this behavior reflects strategy or something more unstable. And once that question enters the conversation, everything accelerates. The claim many people started making quietly that night was simple but explosive. This wasn't improvisation. It was intent leaking out. Here's the factual anchor. When asked again whether Vladimir Putin had been invited to the so-called Board of Peace, Trump didn't hedge. He said, yes, he's one of the people. These are world leaders, and the answer is yes. That sentence matters because it wasn't framed as outreach. It was framed as inclusion. Putin wasn't a problem to be managed. He was a peer to be seated. Now pause on what didn't happen. There was no clarification about what this board is, no explanation of authority, no mention of NATO, the United Nations, or existing diplomatic frameworks, just an assertion that world leaders would be chosen and that Putin was already on the list. Notice what's missing: any sense that this process requires agreement from anyone else. And then, almost immediately, Trump pivoted again, this time to Greenland. On camera, he said the United States has to have it, argued Denmark couldn't protect it, and dismissed Danish sovereignty by saying a boat arriving 500 years ago didn't give them ownership. This wasn't metaphor. It was a territorial argument made plainly without irony. Here's why that detail changes everything. These weren't jokes, and they weren't framed as hypotheticals. They were delivered as statements of necessity, as if the outcome was already decided and the conversation was just catching up. At this point, the pattern becomes hard to ignore. Invite an adversary, threaten an ally, claim territory, all in one appearance, all without institutional context, all normalized through casual language. And this is where escalation begins, because once leaders start speaking this way, the question stops being whether they should. It becomes whether anyone still can stop them. What makes this escalation dangerous isn't just the content, it's how normal it was made to sound. Trump didn't raise his voice. He didn't frame these ideas as extreme. He spoke as if this is how power has always worked. When discussing NATO, he claimed, "I've done more for NATO than anybody else," and suggested the alliance might not exist without him. He described pressuring countries to increase defense spending as proof that he alone holds it together. That's not policy language, that's ownership language. Now, here's the historical echo people are uncomfortable naming. Moments like this don't usually arrive with sirens, they arrive with confidence. Leaders don't announce they're breaking norms, they speak as if the norms were never legitimate to begin with. That's how normalization works. The unthinkable becomes conversational. The extreme becomes logistical. Notice how quickly territorial talk slid into economic threats. A 200% tariff on French wine wasn't framed as retaliation. It was framed as leverage. They'll join, he said, implying compliance isn't a choice, it's a result. That kind of framing matters because it treats sovereign nations the same way a boss treats subordinates. And here's the detail most people gloss over. All of this was said without reference to consequences. No mention of retaliation, no acknowledgement of alliance fracture, no recognition that threatening NATO partners weakens the very structure he claims to protect. This is where the story flips again, because when leaders start acting as if guardrails don't exist, institutions are forced into a choice: confront it, absorb it, or normalize it. And what came next shows just how fast normalization can spread. The next shift is where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Because after threatening allies and floating territorial claims, Trump pivoted to something deeply personal: the Nobel Peace Prize. On camera, he dismissed Norway's claim that the prize is run by an independent committee and said, "If anybody thinks that Norway doesn't control the Nobel Prize, they're just kidding." Then he added, "I don't care what Norway says." Same night, same setting. Here's the factual detail that sharpens this. Trump said a very fine woman believed he deserved the Nobel and that he got it anyway from her. He didn't name her correctly on camera. What matters isn't the mix-up, it's the logic. An international award meant to symbolize restraint and diplomacy was reframed as something owed, withheld unfairly, and therefore irrelevant. Now notice the contradiction. In one breath, he says he doesn't care about the Nobel Prize. In the next, he argues Norway controls it and wronged him by not giving it to him. You can't dismiss something and resent it at the same time unless ego is driving the reaction. And then came the economic claims. Trump said inflation was over, prices were coming down, and that the economy had never been better. He described the United States as the hottest country in the world, pointing to stock markets and 401k as proof. These weren't caveated statements. They were absolute, total success, no downside, no trade-offs. Here's why that detail changes everything. When a leader pairs absolute self-affirmation with grievance against institutions that don't reward him, decision-making starts to orbit validation, not outcomes. Words stop describing reality. They start defending an image. And once power is exercised to protect an image, pressure builds fast. Because the system doesn't bend quietly forever, and then the situation stopped being linear. It stacked. Within the same cycle, Trump was asked about Davos, about what message he would deliver to global leaders. His answer was not caution or reassurance, it was celebration. He said the message would be how well the United States is doing, adding that the country had gone from a dead country to the hottest country in the world. He pointed to stock markets at all-time highs and told reporters, "You don't have to tell me, your numbers are the best they've ever been." Factually, that matters because it completes the loop. Threats abroad, certainty at home. No acknowledgement of tension between the two. No suggestion that one might affect the other. Just momentum, framed as proof of correctness. At the same time, media allies amplified and normalized the rhetoric. On television, proposals were floated to offer Greenland residents up to $100,000, even $500,000 per person to facilitate annexation. That's not a rumor. It was stated on air, framed as economic opportunity, with Greenland's population cited at around 56,000 people. Speed matters here, An idea that would have been unthinkable years ago moved from tarmac talk to cable television framing almost instantly. Then came the political reinforcement. Supportive lawmakers argued this wasn't about ego or spectacle, but about protecting the homeland and asserting influence in the Western Hemisphere. The map was invoked, geography was invoked, inevitability was implied. The message was simple: this isn't radical, it's rational. Now watch how fast this stacks into a pressure point. Territorial talk, economic inducements, media justification, political defense, none of it slowed the rhetoric down. It accelerated it. This is the moment where systems either apply brakes or lose them. So here's the question that hangs in the air now. What happens if this doesn't stop? At this point, the story stops being about him and starts being about you. Because when leaders talk this way, ordinary people are the ones who absorb the shock. Not presidents, not pundits, not the people speaking from studios or tarmacs. It's the people whose lives sit downstream from these decisions. Trade threats don't stay theoretical. Tariffs move prices. Alliance instability moves markets. Territorial conflict moves soldiers. Factually, this shift was articulated most clearly by a sitting U.S. senator and veteran who said on air that when leaders stop thinking first about peace, it's young men and women from Ohio, from New Mexico, from Arizona, from New York who end up paying the price. His words weren't abstract. He said plainly that it wouldn't be the president's children fighting these wars. It would be people like him, people from working families, people with no say in the decision. That's the human layer most coverage avoids. When power is exercised impulsively, the cost isn't evenly distributed. It concentrates on service members, on families, on communities that absorb inflation, instability, and loss while being told everything is hotter than ever. And here's the detail that quietly changes how this feels. The senator described Greenland not as a map location, but as a potential battlefield created by a dumb man's decision and a petty man's decision. That's not ideology. That's lived experience talking. Someone who knows what happens when rhetoric turns into orders. If any of this feels familiar, if it feels like decisions are being made far away with consequences that land close to home, say so in the comments. Because millions of people are recognizing the same pattern at the same time. And when that happens, the story isn't just political anymore, it becomes systemic. Here's the unsettling part that sits beneath all of this. What you're watching isn't just about one person's temperament. It's about how modern power responds to incentives. The system doesn't reward restraint. It rewards attention, dominance, and spectacle. The louder the statement, the faster it travels. The more extreme the claim, the harder it is to challenge in real time. Factually, look at what happened in sequence. A chaotic press appearance produced immediate wall-to-wall coverage. Media allies reframed the most extreme ideas as bold strategy. Supportive lawmakers defended them as realism. Within hours, the conversation wasn't about whether these claims were appropriate. It was about how to implement them, justify them, or soften them for public consumption. That's the mechanism. When institutions are slow and spectacle is fast, spectacle wins. Not because it's correct, but because it fills the vacuum first. And once an idea is normalized on television, even as debate, it becomes harder to treat as unacceptable. Notice what's quietly happening here. No formal process was invoked, no vote was taken, no treaty was debated, but the Overton window still moved, invading territory, coercing allies, dismissing international law. All of it shifted from unthinkable to disgust. This is why outrage alone never stops moments like this. The system absorbs it, turns it into content, turns it into noise, and as long as attention flows, the incentives stay aligned. The most dangerous insight isn't that this is chaotic, it's that it works. And once it works once, it rarely stays contained. From here, the trajectory splits, and neither path is comfortable. On one path, the rhetoric hardens into action. Words become leverage. Leverage becomes policy. Allies begin planning around instability instead of cooperation. Markets price in uncertainty. Military planners start gaming scenarios they hoped would never be necessary. Nothing dramatic happens all at once. It happens in increments. A tariff here, a diplomatic freeze there, a quiet repositioning of forces that never makes headlines until it's already normal. On the other path, resistance forms inside the system. Not protests, not slogans, internal friction, courts, legislators, career officials slowing processes, demanding procedures, forcing pauses. This path doesn't look dramatic on television, which is why it's easy to miss, but it's the only path that reintroduces gravity into decision-making. The problem is timing. Friction works slowly, spectacle moves fast. Here's the detail that matters now. The conversation has already moved from, did this happen, to what happens next. That shift alone signals momentum. Once a leader speaks as if outcomes are inevitable, the system has to either validate that inevitability or confront it directly. There's very little neutral ground. And notice something else. No one is treating this as a joke anymore. European leaders are de-escalating. Lawmakers are warning publicly. The word insane is being used on record. That doesn't happen unless people believe the next move is already forming. The question isn't whether there will be consequences. It's which version arrives first. Here's the single insight that pulls all of this together. This wasn't about peace or tariffs or Greenland or even the Nobel Prize. It was about how power behaves when it stops feeling constrained. When a leader speaks as if institutions are optional, allies are leverage, and outcomes are personal, the system doesn't collapse immediately. It bends quietly, then suddenly. Reframe the night on that tarmac in one sentence. A president didn't just test boundaries, he spoke as if they were already gone. That's why this moment matters more than any individual claim he made. Because once language shifts, action follows. And once action follows, the costs are paid by people who never had a microphone in the first place. What happens next won't be decided in a single speech or a single vote. It will be decided by whether this kind of power is treated as noise or as a signal. Because if it's treated as noise, the next escalation won't sound shocking at all. And this is where the loop opens. The next chapter of this story is already forming behind closed doors and in public statements that seem small until they aren't. If you want to understand it as it unfolds, not after the damage is done, follow, subscribe, and stay here. Because once you see how this pattern works, you can't unsee it.